So good afternoon. We're so excited to have you guys join our webinar today. My name is Isabel Mann, and I'm the Teacher Programs and Curriculum Specialist here at the National WWII Museum. And for our webinar today, we are joined by Dory Gerber from the Institute for Curriculum Services. And in our webinar today, we're really going to dive into this question of why did Kristallnacht happen? And to really dive into this question, we need to take a step back and look at the longer history of anti-Semitism in Europe. And that's what Dory from the Institute for Curriculum Services is going to help us do today. She's going to walk us through this longer history of European anti-Semitism, give us some really concrete and practical teaching strategies for teaching this history to our students. And then towards the end, I'm going to pop in again and talk specifically about Kristallnacht, some more details about that event, as well as some museum resources that can help you teach Kristallnacht, as well as the broader history of the Holocaust. And so with that, I am going to go ahead and turn things over to Dory. But before I do just want to let you guys all know this is a Zoom webinar. So we can't see your faces or hear you, but we can see everything you're putting into the chat box. So if you have questions for us or comments, I know Dory is going to have a few interactions throughout her presentation. Please go ahead and utilize that chat box. That's how we can communicate with you. I almost forgot to tell you guys that. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Dory.
Thank you so much, Isabel, and thank you for inviting me to share this very important component in the greater contextual story of how did Kristallnacht happen, where did it come from, what were the origins of it, and we'll do that through this conversation of the history of European anti-Semitism. So again, I'm thrilled to be here with you all. My name is Dory Gerber, and I am an educator with the Institute for Curriculum Services. So let me tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. We are a nonprofit education initiative, and we're based in San Francisco, California. Our mission is that we are dedicated to improving the quality of K-12 education on topics related to Jewish history, essentially. And the way we do this is by designing standards-aligned curricula. So we take a look at what are national standards and from their state standards that have to do with topics related to Jews, Judaism, Jewish history. And we create, as I mentioned, standards-aligned curricula rooted in primary sources. As you can see, we are a consortium member of the Library of Congress's Teaching with Primary Sources program. We are committed to ensuring that the resources that we offer allow your students the opportunity to think critically and independently when making meaning about historical and current events. And ultimately, what we believe is that an excellent education is essential to building a strong civil society where all people can flourish. Now, what you'll notice on the next slide are the different curricula topics that we offer. The blue being the subheads under the social studies umbrella, with the maroon being the specific topics themselves. So if you see topics that align with your instruction, feel free to visit our website and to grab the free resources off of our website to support your instruction. Also, if you are at the district level or you are an educator that would like to have PD like this brought to your district, please reach out to me and we can provide this professional development on these topics to your district, to the educators that you support. Now, in our session today, in our time together, as we set the context of what Isabel will then tag in on, is that we're going to look at what anti-Semitism means. We'll trace the trajectory of what is sometimes termed the longest hatred through European history, stopping before the Holocaust and before World War II. And we will focus on the complexity of this form of hatred, of anti-Semitism. We'll take a look at some primary sources to help us get a little bit more context of this information. And as always, with all ICS professional development, you'll leave with access to a robust collection of resources on this topic. Okay. I do want to say one quick thing before we hop into the names for a second, is that one of the reasons we stopped specifically before the Holocaust and World War II is that it's important for us to be able to help students answer the question, how did the Holocaust happen? Or where did anti-Semitism come from? So it's our hope that by exploring 2,000 years of the trajectory of anti-Semitism, that we'll be able to provide the context for you to help answer that question for your students. And we stopped specifically at the start of the Holocaust and World War II because there are so many wonderful educational organizations out there, like the World War II Museum, like the National Holocaust Museum, like Yad Vashem, that provide wonderful resources in Holocaust education. We're hoping to provide you with a prequel, if you will. Okay, so just wanted to share that with you a little bit. Now, before we get into the content of this topic, I want to unpack some names that you might recognize that are connected to the Jewish people. So first, we're going to start with Hebrews, right? You recognize this term in the as the first three generations: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They were called Hebrews. This term appears in the book of Exodus, and it's a term that means one who crosses over. And then another term that you might be familiar with is Israelites, right? And this is a term that comes from the Hebrew Bible, translates to children of Israel. And this term was applied until the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE, a term that means those that struggle. Now, these two terms broadly describe the same people over different points in time. Now, the terms Hebrews and Israelites are ancient terms, as I mentioned, found in the first 5 books of Moses. Neither term is appropriate for describing modern day Jews, which we'll talk about next. So, as you can see, the term Jews is the accurate group name for the Jewish people as an ethnic and religious group that started to come into use from 722 BCE and is what is used today to describe this group of people, right? It's a term that originated from the Hebrew word Yehudi, meaning from the kingdom of Judah, later called Judea, until 70 CE. And it's a term that means those who are grateful. And let's talk about Judaism. So it is the monotheistic religion of the Jewish people, but while Judaism is the religion of the Jewish people, not all Jews consider themselves religious or practice Judaism, which is where you see in the above definition for Jews, where it says the term used to associate with Jewish people as an ethnic and religious group, right? Some only are represented or represent the term Jews as an ethnicity and not as a religion, which is where sometimes it gets a little confusing as to understand what is or who exactly is a Jew, okay? And then we're going to talk about the term Israeli, right? So some people use Israeli as a synonym for Jew, but this really is inaccurate, as Israeli refers to citizenship, and it includes people of different faiths, different ethnicities, just as in America, as American does here in the United States, right? So it might be helpful for your students to understand that today, in the 21st century, Hebrew is a language, does not refer to a modern group of people. And as I mentioned earlier, using the term Hebrews to describe Jews is a term of antiquity and is completely out of date. Okay. So now let's take a look at one more term to build some context for our conversation today. So the term anti-Semitism was coined in 1879 by a German writer named Wilhelm Marr, right? And it was derived in contrast to previous centuries when hatred or prejudice against Jews was anchored in anti-religious conviction or anti-Judaism, which we will start to explore in just a moment. Now, Marr used the word anti-Semitism to emphasize a perceived racial inferiority of the Jews. This occurred during a time when the idea about the biology of race were developing and being used to justify control over minority populations. This was taking place both in Europe and in the United States, okay? And then you can see the definition for anti-Semitism being hatred, discrimination, fear, and prejudice against Jews as individuals or as a group based on age-old stereotypes and myths, okay, which was how the term was coined by Wilhelm Marr, okay? So the question is, why isn't there a hyphen in anti-Semitism? And this might be in contrast to what Google or Microsoft Word says when you are typing the term in your computer, right? So in the mid-19th century, the derived word Semite became a category to classify humans based on a racialist pseudoscience. And we'll talk more about that later. But I want to point out the second bullet there for you. So the placement of hyphen after anti would indicate that anti-Semitism refers to all people who speak Semitic languages or those classified as Semites. But as we just discussed on the previous slide, the term anti-Semitism came into use to describe anti-Jewish campaigns at the time. And today we know that anti-Semitism is used to describe and analyze past and present forms of opposition or hatred only towards Jews. Now, this is a really fascinating topic of conversation. And if you're interested in learning more about this, in Deborah Lipstat's book, Anti-Semitism Here and Now, she devotes some time to talk about to hyphenate or not to hyphenate the term anti-Semitism. So there are many layers to anti-Semitism that have accumulated over the centuries. And there's a scholar named Willem Brustein who identifies 4 historical forms of anti-Semitism, and they are religious, economic, political, and racial. And we're going to explore those forms as we examine the chronicle evolution of anti-Semitism. So what I'd like us to do now is go way back in time. Go ahead, Isabel. You can go forward as we're going to go back in time. Thank you. We're going to go way back in time to the Roman Empire. And during this time, anti-Judaism, as I mentioned, the oldest form of anti-Semitism, was present. Now, keep in mind, at this time, Judaism is a monotheistic religion in a polytheistic world, right? Jews wouldn't worship Roman gods, and they kept their cultural identity. So they were viewed as outsiders who were resisting total Roman rule. And so therefore, they were essentially punished for many of the observances that you see there on the screen. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Jesus, right? So we know that the man referred to as Jesus was born and died as one of the Jewish people. And in his short time on earth, he lived the life of teaching messages of peace, of goodness, of kindness to others, which was in the example of other Jewish teachers, right? And it's important to know that his understanding his role in the greater story is an important part of the conversation. So, and we want to keep in mind that followers of Jesus, right, formed a number of Jewish sects, which would eventually usher in the onset of Christianity. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how most of our knowledge of Jesus comes from the second part of the Christian Bible, or the New Testament, which is where the seeds for a religious precursor to anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism are sown, right? And the New Testament's context is critical to understanding what is going on. So the negative depiction of Jews in these texts often reflect an internal debate between Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah and traditional Jews who did not view Jesus as sacred. And in time, as more Gentiles or non-Jews come to believe in Jesus, much harder lines are drawn between the two groups. Now, it's important to note that the gospel texts, right, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were not written by people who knew Jesus directly. They were written in the 40 to 70 years after Jesus's death by Jewish followers of Jesus. And the books were assigned these names much later than that. Now, when the Romans, we're going to go ahead to the next slide, Isabel. Thank you so much. Now, when the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE, many Jews were killed or they were forced to leave the land of Judea. And so by the 11th century, you'll start to see small Jewish communities in countries throughout Europe, as well as the Middle East and North Africa. Now, most of the sects of Judaism that had existed were wiped out. And those that remained, as I mentioned before, like those who were Jesus's followers, they were forced to reinvent themselves, ushering in then the onset of Christianity. And you'll notice, especially on the next slide, that resettlement is a common, or not the next slide, in a couple of slides, that resettlement is a common theme throughout Jewish history. So what we do know, and we can now go to the next slide, Isabel, thank you. What we do know is that Jesus was killed by the Romans, as were countless others who were seen as a threat to Roman rule. But early Christians who were angry that Jews did not believe Jesus was the Son of God or the Messiah, and wanting Romans to follow their new Christian religion, they taught that it was the Jews, not the Romans, who were to blame for the crucifixion of Christ. Now, this was a myth that had led to hundreds of years of persecution and really was the basis of religious anti-Semitism. Now, since World War II, there have been various Christian denominations that have taken steps to disavow the charge of deicide or the blaming of Jews for Jesus's death. One example actually started with the Catholic Church and the Second Vatican Council's Nostra Aetate in 1965. Another more recent example was in 2011, when Pope Benedict explicitly exonerated Jews from all blame for the crucifixion and death of Jesus in his book, Jesus of Nazareth. We can go ahead on to the next slide, please. Now, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, political power in the Middle Ages became linked to the church. So the church controlled all aspects of life, which is seen as really preparation for life after death. So anyone who was not a Christian was regarded as the enemy. And you'll see on the next slide that during the medieval period, anti-Judaism, right? We mentioned that anti-Judaism was the religious form of anti-Semitism, was heavily prevalent. And in addition to the restrictions on Jewish life and religious practice that was set out by the Romans and their legal codes, Christians added laws in the medieval period that further attempted to prohibit any sort of fraternization between Jews and Christians. So the anti-Jewish laws that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, they are found in the codes of Constantine, Constantius, Theodosius II, and many of these laws persisted long after the collapse of the Roman Empire. They made their way into the legal codes of European empires and countries, as well as influenced Muslim legal codes as well. Now, when you take a look at those anti-Jewish laws, do they seem familiar in any way? Can you think of other periods of time where those laws might have been, where those laws may have been similar? If you can think of another time period, go ahead and add that to the chat box for us. See if you can make any connections to those anti-Jewish laws to other time periods in history. Okay, the Holocaust, right? Specifically, maybe the Nuremberg laws, right? What else? Do they remind anyone maybe of the Jim Crow laws? Okay, and if you're shaking your head, yes, you will. Yeah, there you go, Merlin. That is of no coincidence. The Inquisition as well, Susan, absolutely. So again, not a coincidence, and you'll see through our conversation today, a lot of what we're seeing about these laws, the treatment of Jews throughout European history, tends to repeat itself. And you'll come to see that while Hitler did not invent anti-Semitism, he found the way to perfect it, right? So we'll go ahead and continue on the next slide by examining a primary source. As I mentioned, we like to heavily use different types of primary sources in our curricula to provide opportunities for different types of analysis of topics. And so what you're seeing here are figures, right, that are art personifying Christianity and Judaism during the medieval period. On the left is a figure named Ecclesia, and her name stems from the Greek word for church or gathering. And on the right is a statue named Synagoga, whose name means synagogue. So what we're going to do is use the See, Think, Wonder strategy to analyze these primary sources. And what I want you to do in the chat box is we're going to only look at Ecclesia on the left-hand side. Tell me exactly what you see when you look at her without trying to make any inferences, okay, or connections yet. Let's go ahead and just do an eye walk over Ecclesia, and in the chat box, tell me things that you notice that pop out at you when you see Ecclesia. So she's the figure on the left-hand side. Tell me about her appearance, her posture, her clothing, things that you notice that she might be holding. Okay, looks like she seems to be looking to the side, observing. She's holding a cross. Her eyes are uncovered, open, right? Perhaps looking towards the future. Someone mentioned the way her head was tilted. She is holding a cup, right? Perhaps a chalice. Excellent, excellent, excellent. She has an upright posture. She does have a crown on her head. Absolutely. Her clothing, what color is her clothing? She's smiling. Yep. Her crown is straight. Her clothing is white, clean, right? Exactly. Now let's take the same skill and apply that to Synagoga. What do you notice about her? Tell me all the things you notice about her. I like that, Nick. Great connection there. So Synagoga is blindfolded. What else do you notice about her? Looking at some of the similar things you were noticing about Ecclesia, right? About her clothing, her posture, what she's holding. Okay. Her crown is crooked. She looks more average, less legal. Interesting. Perhaps she's holding a scroll. Okay. Her clothing has stripes on it. Okay. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Now let's go ahead and do the think, right? Let's go ahead and think. What inferences can you make? Why might synagogue be blindfolded, but yet ecclesia's eyes are wide open? Oh, I like that, Stephen. Her stripes resemble the stripes of a talit, perhaps. Okay. There's a significant or specific marking to indicate perhaps her religion. Okay. And again, there's a lot of questions that we can ask about that, and we'll do that in the wonder section. So does her left hand hold a book? Perhaps. Okay, so Brenna says represents the difference between law and religion. Jewish blindness to the deity of Jesus, right? That maybe a synagogue is following a blind faith. Excellent, excellent. And again, there are a couple of questions. So when we click on wonder, there are several questions that you've been asking, right? So I'll answer a few of them for you. So it's been interpreted that the broken the broken staff in her hand, in synagogue's hand, is meant to be a reference to the lance that stabbed Christ. And there's also been inferences that the book that is slipping from her hands is the Torah, again, that she is following a blind faith, while ecclesia is following the open, seeing the light faith. Okay. And then you want to encourage your students to ask questions in the wonder component, right? What do they have questions about? Maybe why is the clothing so different? If both are wearing crowns, and crowns tend to be a symbol of regalness and things like that. So again, we want to encourage our students to ask those questions, but then to further research and investigate so that they continue to make further observations and inferences. Okay, so I wanted to take the opportunity to look at a primary source to again get some context in the medieval period of European anti-Semitism. So now we'll head to talking about segregation of Jews, right? So as we continue to understand the form of religious anti-Semitism, I want to point out that in Italy during the 13th century, Jews were marginalized. They were forced to live in separate areas of towns, and they were excluded from all activities, work, education, politics, things like that in mainstream society. And the areas that they were forced to live in were often gated and locked at night. And I want to ask you, right, does this sound familiar to you? And I want to point out the third bullet there on the slide. So the English word ghetto is believed to be derived from the Italian word fiodo, which means foundry, since it's believed that the first Jewish quarter in Venice was near a foundry that once made cannon. So again, the term ghetto, not coined or invented by Hitler or the Nazi Party. And I also think this is an excellent time to have a conversation with students about word derivation, right? And how we, the association we have to the term ghetto today, and how we can maybe make connections to the way we associate the term today to its historical origin, okay? We can go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. So church councils in the Middle Ages, they placed restrictions on the interactions between Christians and Jews. And the Lateran Council, which was convened by Pope Innocent III, is an example of this. And in 1215, in parts of Germany, all Jews were required to wear cone-shaped hats so that they would not be mistaken for quote unquote real Germans. And in other countries, they were required to wear yellow badges on their clothing to identify them as Jews. Now, again, you might associate those markings with the onset of the Nazi anti-Semitic program, with the yellow stars identifying Jewish members of the community with the word Jude on them. And you may not have recognized that this took place, this sort of identifying markers on clothing and things like that took place nearly 730 years prior to the Holocaust. So again, Hitler did not necessarily invent these things. He learned how to perfect them. Now, as we continue to talk about the forms of anti-Semitism that developed, we'll start to talk about economic anti-Semitism. Now, in the Middle Ages, there were very few career options that were open to Jews. And under the manorial system, Jews could not own land, they could not farm, they weren't allowed to join craft guilds. So working as traveling merchants or peddlers or as jewelers, things that were portable, were among the very limited professions that were available to them. Now, usury or money lending with the collection of high interest was against Christian law. It was also against Jewish law, but money lending became, again, one of the very few available professions for Jews during this time. So they had to really make a decision. Were faced with a moral dilemma. Do we break Jewish law in order to somehow make a living for our family? Now, these Jews who chose money lending as a profession were often employed by feudal lords as tax or rent collectors. Now, when you think about paying your taxes, or you think about paying your monthly rent or mortgage or car payment, imagine that feeling that you have when you have to turn that money over. Well, the same was felt by those who owed money to the feudal lords, and they really resented the fact that the Jews were collecting that money, and they came to resent Jews for that, even though they were the messengers. So again, they were being looked upon as a scapegoat. So violence against Jews became very commonplace. And this is where the stereotype of Jews being greedy took root. We can go ahead to the next slide. Now, while that form of economic anti-Semitism began to evolve during the Middle Ages, religious anti-Judaism was still prevalent. And an example of the widespread authority of the church and the religious fervor of the Middle Ages was a series of 9 religious wars, which we know of as the Crusades. And in 1096, Pope Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem, and Christian crusaders set out to free the Holy Land from non-believing Muslims. And along the way, Jews were victimized as non-believers en route to the Middle East. Okay. And the Middle Ages also led to an increase in false accusations that were rooted in religious prejudice against Jews. Most peasants could not read, and so they were dependent upon the sermons that the clergy were giving, or visual images as ways to learn about their religion, as well as those that were non-believing, specifically the Jews, right? Art would often depict Jews as having horns or talons and having a forked tail. And this association of the Jew with the devil was reinforced in sermons and in folk tales. And in the age of superstition, Jews were accused of black magic. Now, on the next slide, we'll learn that another popular anti-Jewish myth at the time was that of blood libel. And if a child went missing, it was often Jews who were blamed, right? The rumor was that Jews needed the blood of Christian children in order to mix into their preparation for matzah for Passover. And of course, this was completely untrue. And there have been claims of blood libel even as recently as 2020, 2021, in reference to Jews and COVID-19, believe it or not. Now, Jews were also accused of spreading the Black Plague, and it was thought that they were poisoning the wells in the communities, in the villages, because they were not dying at the same rate as their Christian neighbors. So I want to ask you this question. based on some of the things that we've been learning, specifically on a few slides ago when we talked about Italy, why might it be that the Jews were not dying at the same rate as the Christian neighbors in the villages? So yes, Tom, there was adherence to sanitary laws, right? Hygiene, as well as dietary laws, right? But think back to the slide when we talked about what was taking place in the 13th century. There you go, Elizabeth. They were not congregating in the same space because they were segregated, right? Here is our first historical example of quarantining. Since they were not really allowed to be in the same parts of town as the majority of the population, it would make sense logically, scientifically, that they would not succumb to the same level of disease as the majority of the members of the community. Exactly. And because of the segregation and herd immunity, if you will, like you're saying, Christopher, that's a great point that you put in there. Absolutely. So again, there was a need to come up with a solution or a reason for the fact that so many were dying due to the plague. And so therefore Jews were the perfect scapegoat, since they did not congregate with the majority of the population. So as a result of this, Jewish communities throughout Europe were wiped out because violence against Jews became rampant as a punishment for the plague. Now, we were talking about resettlement, right? You'll notice that anti-Jewish prejudices resulted in Jews being expelled from most areas of Europe during a period of over 500 years. Jews were driven from their homes, and many fled eastward to the more tolerant kingdom of Poland, Lithuania, where there the rulers promised Jews their safety and allowed them to work, travel, practice their religion freely, gain an education. And you'll notice on that map that many Jews actually settled in the Ottoman Empire, which is the setting for the Arab-Israeli conflict, which we have a session on if that's a topic you are interested in. But again, this is an interesting map to explore as to where Jews were fleeing from and where they chose to settle during this time period of 500 years. Yes, exactly, Wendy. Now in 1517, right, Martin Luther, who was a Roman Catholic monk in Germany, he attacked the Pope and the corruption within the Roman Catholic Church, beginning the Protestant Reformation. Now, Luther hoped that his tolerance would persuade the Jews to convert, but they chose not to adopt his Reformation, and therefore he lashed out against the Jews in his 1543 treatise concerning the Jews and their lives. And you can see he questioned, what then shall we Christians do with this damned rejected race of Jews? And the bullets there highlight many of the suggested things to do with the Jews. Now, his views were not original, and they did represent much of Christian thought at that time period. Now, you will see on the next slide that by the mid-1800s, many Western and European Jews enjoyed new freedoms that were brought about by emancipation. This again might be another time to have a conversation with your students to unpack the term emancipation, what it means, and the association we have to that term in American history. And again, bring back to the context here of European anti-Semitism and the fact that Jews were not seen as free members of society. There you go, Stephen. There you go. Thank you, Napoleon. Now, many in European countries expected that Jews would give up their religion and adopt the lifestyle of the majority of the population, and in effect, stop being Jewish. but most Jews did not give up their beliefs or their traditional Jewish ways of life. So this was seen as a rejection of modern ways by a stubborn people, especially now since Jews were free to leave the ghettos to live and work alongside their non-Jewish neighbors. In some ways, it was almost as if they were viewed as a threat to the, you can see that they were thinking it was a threat in the sense that perhaps the pieces of the pie were now going to get smaller, since Jews were now allowed into mainstream society and have access to the things that were limited to them before this emancipation. Now, due to the emancipation of Jews, right? We'll go ahead on the next slide. Thank you. European anti-Semitism began to shift from a religious form to a more secular and political form. Yeah, there you go, John. Now, new nationalist ideologies that were spreading across Europe, that was brought about by the French Revolution, further justified a resentment towards Jews, identifying them as these unwanted foreigners, right, that were invading European communities. This was, again, especially since many Jews from rural areas of former Poland, which was at that time part of the Russian Empire, they migrated west to seek greater economic and educational opportunities. So again, this was because, unlike the Jews of Western and Central Europe, the Jews that were living in what was called the Pale of Settlement were still marginalized, ill-treated, and oppressed, which we'll talk more about in just a little bit. But on the next slide, we see an example of that growing political anti-Semitism in Europe. And this is a political cartoon, which, as many of you know, is an excellent primary source. And this cartoon features Berlin court preacher Adolf Stoker. He was one of the earliest activists of the anti-Semitic political movement. And you see him in a similar pose of Martin Luther, posting his 95 Theses on the door of a synagogue. Now, Stoker, he was a theologian, but he campaigned against Jews primarily on social issues. Now, immediately after his first anti-Semitic speech and the foundation of his Christian Social Party, there was a weekly publication called the Collaborators, a German publication, that published this cartoon. And on it, you can see really just one phrase, hep hep, which was the battle cry of early anti-Semitic riots in 1819 in Germania. We can go ahead to the next slide. Here's another example of that growing political anti-Semitism in another political cartoon. This is from a German weekly satirical magazine published in 1903. And it shows a Russian immigrant transforming himself from a poor ragman into a member of elite society. Now, anti-Semites saw the energy at which Jews made the most of the opportunities offered to them by this emancipation in European society as a true threat to their traditional values. And you can see the caption there on the screen really does highlight the general sentiment of Europeans during this period of time. Now, on the next slide, we'll see that France was the first European country to, yeah, that's right, Susan, to emancipate Jews in 1791, guaranteeing them equality of all of its citizens, regardless of their religion. And to Jews, this meant full citizenship without any conditions. But in 1894, yes, Jane, you'll get all the resources, I promise. In 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, who was a Jewish officer in the French army, he was falsely convicted and accused of treason. Now, he was later exonerated, but the fact that he was convicted, it revealed this reality that the majority of the French population was concerned about Jews in power, and they were willing to believe that Jews all Jews, right, like Dreyfus, were likely traitors. Now, it was this case that was the impetus for Theodor Herzl's declaration for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which again, we discussed in our Arab-Israeli conflict. We'll go back and talk a little bit on the next slide about what was happening in Imperial Russia, right? So the Tsarist government forced Jews to settle in only a certain area of Russia, which was called the Pale of Settlement. Now here, and in the areas that Russia had taken over after the division of Poland, most Jews lived in poverty. They were crammed into towns, often making up the majority of the inhabitants. Only some members of the small Jewish upper class were permitted to live in cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg. The legal discrimination of Jews increased during the 19th century because the Tsarist government regarded Jews to be a potential revolutionary element. Now, in 1887, there was a quota system for Jewish students, which became introduced, causing many Russian Jews to go ahead and study in Germany, Austria, or Switzerland, which again increased the population of Jews in those countries. Now, during the reigns of Alexander III, Nicholas II, as a means to divert the popular discontent at the appalling living conditions and the autocratic control, Russian authorities encouraged anti-Semitic violence. So these anti-Jewish riots, or pogroms as they were called, took place over the next 3 decades. At that time, about 2 million Russian Jews left between the years of 1881 and 1914, mostly emigrating to the United States. And it wasn't until the Russian Revolution ended Tsarist rule that the Jews finally became emancipated. And we'll see on the next slide when Nicholas II's power over his empire faded as revolutionary groups plotted to overthrow him. And then in 1905, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was written, and it was said to be a secret plan of a group of powerful Jews who were plotting the collapse of the Christian countries in order to bring about Jewish world domination. And you can see the book covers there really highlighting the serpent-like or animalistic-like characteristics of stereotypes of Jews and their perceived plot to suck the life out of the earth, if you will, right? World domination. It was discovered that the book was a forgery by Russian secret police, intended to make it look as if revolutionaries who wanted to overthrow the Tsar were controlled by Jews. Now, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and we're on the next slide, made it look as if revolutionaries who wanted to overthrow the Tsar were controlled by Jews. Now, many Jews who supported the revolution in 1917, they were socialists who took control of Russia under the leadership of Lenin in October of 1917. Now, anti-Semites, especially in Germany, made a very big deal about the fact that Lenin's second in command was Leon Trotsky, who happened to be Jewish. Now, just as in the Middle Ages, when Jews were wrongly blamed for the Black Death, in the 20th century, Jews were then being blamed for a new plague that seemed to be sweeping Europe, known as communism, right? Now, after communists took power in Russia, the protocols were reprinted throughout Europe as well as in the United States. And this book became especially popular in Germany, which was reeling from their World War I defeat in 1918. And its readership included an army corporal named none other than, I bet you can guess, Adolf Hitler. We'll go ahead on the next slide and discuss that the devastation of Germany's defeat in World War I and the fear of communist revolution fueled mass discontent within the Weimar Republic and its complex multi-party system. This radicalized the pre-existing right-wing anti-Semitic political parties and gave rise to the Nazi Party. So the presence of assimilated Jews in German life made them very convenient scapegoats for Germany's misfortune. And you can see that illustrated there on the postcard on the screen. This is an Austrian postcard from 1919, and it shows a caricatured Jew stabbing the German army in the back with a dagger. So the surrender in 1918 was blamed on the unpatriotic, the socialists, the Bolsheviks, the Republicans, and especially the Jews. And again, this postcard and some of the other primary sources that I've shown in the presentation today will be available in the session's lesson plan and extension activity. Now we're going to go ahead and unpack the last form of anti-Semitism, racial anti-Semitism. Now in 1859, British scientist Charles Darwin published his book called The Origin of the Species. And in that book, he said that all life on Earth had evolved over millions of years. Now, some misused Darwin's idea to claim that humans had evolved into distinct groups or races. They thought at the top of these groups were the white Europeans or the Aryan race, and that Jews were a separate Semitic race. So the idea of race was a human construct, right? And for those obsessed with the Jewish problem, the idea of a Semitic race meant that Jews were different, right? They were born differently from other people and therefore could never be part of mainstream society. Now, on the next slide, we'll revisit Wilhelm Marr, who we know coined the term anti-Semitism. He and his fellow anti-Semites, they didn't believe that a person stopped being Jewish if he had converted to Christianity. So for them, Jews would be members of the so-called Semitic race, regardless their religion. So hatred of Jews for religious reasons was now being joined by this idea that Jewish people were an inferior race. And so the solution to this Jewish question or the Jewish problem, these anti-Semites would argue, was for them to leave Europe. Now, on the next slide, you see some visual representations of the idea of scientific, quote, right, anti-Semitism based on a pseudoscientific belief that evidence actually exists to support or justify racism. Of course, it absolutely does not. Now, proponents use a number of different disciplines within the sciences, as well as anthropology, in order to categorize people by their physical characteristics, like their skull shape, their facial attributes, body types, so on and so forth. And these photographs that you see are comparing Aryan and Semitic noses. And the illustration on the right is from the children's book, The Poisonous Mushroom. They're both from the Nazi period, and they illustrate the idea of scientific anti-Semitism. So we'll start to wrap up our conversation here as we gear up to start to learn more about Kristallnacht and discuss a little bit about Hitler. He believed in the lies that have been said about the Jewish people ever since the early days of Christianity. He believed that the Jews were the greatest threat to the so-called Aryan race, and that either the German people would defeat the Jewish race or be destroyed by what he saw as a Jewish communist menace. And in his book, Mein Kampf, he reveals how much he had been taken in by the lies written in the protocols. And that once people would read that book, the Jewish menace would be broken. So we know that the Nazi Party gained political strength throughout the late 1920s into the 1930s, really taking advantage of Germany's critical economic situation and their lack of experience with a parliamentary democracy. Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933, and that's when he began to dismantle the Weimar Republic and implement his anti-Semitic program. Now, less than 3 months after coming into power in Germany, the Nazi leadership stages an economic boycott targeting Jewish-owned businesses, as well as the offices of Jewish professionals. So this boycott was presented to the German people as both a reprisal as well as an act of revenge for the bad international press against Germany since the appointment of Hitler's government. So the Nazis claimed that German and foreign Jews were spreading these atrocity stories to damage Germany's reputation. So Nazi stormtroopers stood menacingly in front of Jewish-owned department stores and a retail establishment, holding signs, shouting slogans such as "Don't buy from the Jews" or "The Jews are our misfortune." Now, this national boycott campaign really only lasted one day, and it was ignored by a significant sector of the German population, Jewish German community, and they'd still continue to shop in Jewish-owned stores and seek the services of Jewish professionals. But the boycott was important because it marked the beginning of this nationwide campaign by the Nazi Party against Jews in Germany. And this campaign would ultimately culminate in the Holocaust. In 1935, Hitler enacted the Nuremberg Laws as a means to exclude German Jews from Reich citizenship and prohibited them from marrying or having any relations with persons of German or related blood. Additional ordinances to the laws disenfranchised Jews and deprived them most of their political rights. And you can see the initial laws listed there on the screens. And many Germans who had not practiced Judaism for years found themselves caught in the grip of this Nazi parties, this Nazi terror, if you will. And even people with Jewish grandparents who had converted to Christianity were defined as Jews. And remember, this came from the idea that Wilhelm Marr had said that just because someone converted to Christianity did not stop them from being a Jew based on this idea of racial pseudoscience, right? Now we'll wrap up here on the next slide with knowing that throughout the 1930s, additional laws were announced that decreased the civil rights and the daily behaviors for all Jews in Germany. And many of these are reminiscent of the anti-Semitic actions or policies of previous centuries that we saw in those anti-Jewish laws, if you remember. And why does it say to be continued at the bottom of the screen? Because this is where our timeline of events, what I call the prequel, right, to the understanding of the Holocaust and World War II begin. And it's my hope that through all the information that was shared in this portion of the session, you'll now have the resources you need to help answer that common question that students often ask, which is, where did anti-Semitism come from and how did the Holocaust happen? And so now I turn it over to Isabel, who's going to talk to you about Kristallnacht, right? And how that connects to what we just unpacked in this time together. And then when we come back, I'll share the session's resources and how you can get your hands on all of the resources for this topic. So thank you so much for your participation and your attention.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dory. So we're gonna dive into straight from there into Kristallnacht. And at Nuremberg, the Nuremberg laws flow almost immediately to Kristallnacht. And so what we see is that the Nazis didn't just use the legal system with laws like the Nuremberg laws to persecute and target the Jewish population in Germany, but that very quickly leads to the use of violence, systematic violence against the Jewish individuals. And we see that almost 3 years later, after the passing of the Nuremberg laws, with an event called Kristallnacht. And so what we see from November 9th through the 10th in 1938, again, just about 3 years after the passing of the Nuremberg laws, is we see the first open acts of mass violence against Jewish people in Germany, annexed Austria, and the Sudetenlands. During this 2-day period, the Nazis and their supporters destroyed Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues across Germany, as well as across annexed German territory. And during this two-day period, because there was so much broken glass at the end of this violence, from the destroyed buildings, the synagogues, and the homes, this event became known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Now, at the time, Nazi government officials claimed these anti-Jewish pogroms were a spontaneous reaction of the German people to the assassination of a German diplomat, Ernst von Rath, when in reality, this violence was carefully planned and orchestrated by the Nazis and their collaborators. Von Rath was a German embassy official who was stationed in Paris. And on November 7th, a 17-year-old Polish Jew, Herschel Grinspan, shot von Rath, and he ended up dying 2 days later on November 9th. Now, again, the Nazi government officials claimed that in a spontaneous outburst of violence against the Jewish population, that is how Kristallnacht happens. But in actuality, we know looking back through the sources that this was something that was carefully planned and orchestrated by the Nazi Party leadership. And they simply used this assassination as the pretext to unleash a night of anti-Semitic violence against Jewish individuals in Germany and Germany's annexed territories. So from November 9th through 10th in 1938, Nazi Party officials, members of the SA or stormtroopers, and the Hitler Youth, as well as ordinary German citizens, destroyed hundreds of synagogues and Jewish institutions. Many of these buildings burned in full view of the public, as well as in full view of local firefighters who had received orders to let these buildings burn and to only intervene if these flames began to spread to other non-Jewish buildings. An estimated 7,500 Jewish businesses were damaged and looted during this 2-day period. And then beyond this property destruction, mobs attacked in the streets and in their homes Jewish individuals. Now, at the time, the Nazi government claimed that there had only been 91 Jewish individuals killed on November 9th and 10th, but we know from recent historical scholarship that number is closer to the hundreds of Jewish individuals who were murdered during the violence of Kristallnacht. During this 2-day period, we also see for the very first time that the Nazis en masse arrested Jewish men and boys from the ages of 16 to 60 and sent them to concentration camps. Units of SS and Gestapo arrested up to 30,000 Jewish men and transfer them to Dachau, Buchenwald, and other concentration camps. And this is really the first time that Nazi officials made massive arrests of Jewish individuals, specifically because they were Jewish and for no other reasons. When Hitler and the Nazi Party gained control of the German government in 1933, we see very quickly that they start to send political opponents to concentration camps like Dachau with no due process of the law. But it's with Kristallnacht, the violence of Kristallnacht, that we see for the first time that the Nazi government arrests Jews simply because they are Jewish and for no other reason. And in the photograph on this slide, you can see Jewish men being marched through Berlin on their way to be sent to a concentration camp during the events of Kristallnacht. Now, following the violence of Kristallnacht, the Nazi government announced that the Jewish community was actually to blame for this violence and destruction. And the government ended up imposing a fine of 1 billion Reichsmark, which equated to about $400 million at that time, on the Jewish community. And so not only were Jewish individuals being fined after the destruction of their homes, their businesses, and their places of worship. But when they submitted claims to their insurance companies to help pay to repair this damage, all of those insurance payouts were confiscated by the Nazi government. And so it ended up being the financial hardship of Jewish individuals to try to clean up and repair the property that was damaged and looted during this time period. And it's at this point, with this first large-scale open act of violence that the Nazis commit with Kristallnacht, that many Jewish individuals began to realize that they need to leave Germany. But it was very, very difficult at this point to leave Germany. You needed to have the finances to do so. And for many Jewish individuals with their homes and businesses having recently been destroyed, that made it that much more difficult to find the resources to leave, to get out. And then beyond that, many countries, including the United States, had strict immigration laws that prevented Jewish refugees from entering their countries. And so despite the fact that at this point, after Kristallnacht, many Jewish individuals decide they do want to leave and try to get out from Germany, this simply was not an option for many Jewish individuals during and after Kristallnacht. And so now that I've talked a little bit about Kristallnacht, I do want to hear from a Holocaust survivor who lived through Kristallnacht. Her name is Anneliese Nussbaum. She was born on January 8th, 1929 in Germany. And in her oral history testimony, she says that she did not have a childhood without Nazi rule. And in this clip, she's going to talk a little bit about what it was like to live through Kristallnacht as a child, as well as how her life changed following this event. This is an oral history clip that can be found online through the World War II Museum's digital collections. And I think this would be a really powerful oral history testimony to show students when talking about Kristallnacht in your classroom. And so we're going to go ahead and move into playing this video.
I mentioned before how proud I was of the synagogue, how much it meant to me, and I participated. And I loved it when I loved my father singing. He had a good voice. I had to listen to his sermons, which I didn't always understand, and that's for sure, because I was way too young to do that. But the other beautiful part was that my mother was also in the choir, and she sang from the Hallel, and which says, "The Lord is with me, I shall not fear. What can a man do to me?" Unquote. What can a man do? Well, we found out. We found out. And the next thing we knew, it was Kristallnacht. I was in school, and somebody rushed into our place and said, "Our synagogue is on fire. My home is on fire." It was the most devastating thing I could have heard. And my father walked me home. We were silent until we got home, not a word between us. I can't even imagine how he must have felt about it, but I know how I felt. I can only talk to myself about myself. And it was the kind of thing where I feel today, that was the day where the Holocaust started for me. Yes, I still slept in my bed for the next 2 years or whatever. But life most certainly changed for me forever. It was
no more hope.
No more. We knew we had to get out. And then the desperation to see in my family, other members of my family, the people around us, friends, losing some of my classmates, others wanting to go, not go. It was something that will really never leave me, because it took permanency away from my house. I knew we had to go.
And so I find her experiences and her story really powerful. You can hear the emotion in her voice when she remembers finding out that her synagogue, what she calls her home, had been destroyed. And so if you have the time in your class to incorporate oral history testimony, I think bringing in a story like Annaliese's story would be powerful for your students. Now, Annaliese and her family ended up not leaving Germany. And in July 1941, she and her family were sent to the Theresienstadt ghetto, along with 400 other Jewish families. She stayed in Theresienstadt until October 1942, when she, her mother, and her aunt were transferred to Auschwitz. Her aunt was sick and was immediately sent to her death, but she and her mother did end up surviving the Holocaust. And in 1945, she and her mom were liberated by US forces. After the war, Annalise was able to immigrate to the United States, where she became an accountant and eventually met her husband, Martin Nussbaum. And so to continue talking a little bit about Kristallnacht, I want to take a moment to show you guys a photograph that I often used in the classroom with my students when I was in the classroom teaching as an educator. And this is a common photograph of Kristallnacht. You can find it on the United States Holocaust Memorial and Museum's website. And what I often did with students is I would show them this photograph and I would ask them, what are the people doing in this photograph as the building, it's a synagogue, burns in the background? And I see John puts in the chat box that these people are doing nothing. And so that's immediately what students will say. They're not doing anything. I see some people looking and not doing anything. I see some people walking by as though it's not even happening. And so this can open up a really powerful conversation with our students about what choices did individual Germans have during the Holocaust. And so I asked that to students. These individuals who are either standing and watching the synagogue burn, or who are walking by and doing nothing, who are standing by, what choices did they have available to them? And almost always, whether I was working with 5th grade students or 10th grade students, they almost always came up with 3 different kinds of choices that these individuals had. They could stand by and do nothing, be bystanders like we see in this photograph. They had the choice to potentially collaborate with what was happening during Kristallnacht, maybe collaborate with the Nazis to damage, loot other Jewish buildings and institutions. Or they had the choice to stand up and do something, maybe try to put out this fire to prevent other Jewish buildings from being burned, to prevent Jewish individuals from being arrested and sent to concentration camps. And students immediately get that these individuals in this photograph, although they're standing and doing nothing, that was not their only option. They had choices during Kristallnacht, and the choices that individual Germans made during Kristallnacht mattered. As I said earlier, Kristallnacht, although the Nazis claimed it was spontaneous, it was not spontaneous. It was something that was carefully planned and orchestrated. And part of the Nazis' reasoning behind planning this event, these pogroms against Jewish Germans, is they wanted to see how far they could go. They wanted to see how far they could go before the German people resisted, stood up and said, this is not okay, before the international community said, this is not okay. And what the Nazis found with Kristallnacht is that most people, most countries, would stand by and do nothing, even in the face of open mass violence against a group of people in their own country. And that choice during Kristallnacht to stand by and do nothing, it mattered. That choice mattered, and it sent a powerful signal to the Nazi government that they could go further. And that's exactly what we see happen. Less than a year after Kristallnacht, on September 1st, 1939, as I know many of you all know as history teachers, World War II officially begins when Nazi Germany invades Poland. Now, the invasion of Poland, and even before that, the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenlands, this all went back to two important ideas that the Nazis had about race and space. Hitler and the Nazis firmly believed that the German people were superior, and because of that, they believed that the German people deserved more space and land to expand into, and they planned to take that land from people that they viewed as racially inferior. And this didn't just include Jewish individuals, but it also included people from Eastern Europe, people from countries like Poland. And so during World War II, using a method of warfare called the Blitzkrieg, the German military invaded a lot of different countries. And by 1941, we see that they had occupied almost all of Europe. And in every country they went to, the Nazis used the same laws and violence against the local Jewish communities there that they had used against their own Jewish communities in Germany. And then they went even further. And so now I want to take a moment to listen to a second individual story. Her name is Eva Schlotz. And she's going to tell us a little bit about what it was like to go through the selection process at Auschwitz a few years after World War II officially began. Eva Schlotz was born in Vienna, Austria in 1929. She and her family fled to Amsterdam after Germany annexed Austria, and that's where she actually met Anne Frank and her family. In 1942, when the Nazis occupied the Netherlands, she and her family went into hiding. But in 1944, she and her family were betrayed, and she was sent to Westerbork concentration camp and then to Auschwitz. And so in this clip, she's going to talk a little bit about what it was like to arrive at Auschwitz. And so we're going to go ahead and play this clip.
And the doors were pulled open, and we saw Nazis, and we heard barking of dogs, and a command in German that we had to jump down, which we did. And the first moment was great relief, you know, fresh air and stretch a little bit. But then we saw the sign on the station, and it was Auschwitzim, which is a Polish name for Auschwitz. And it was an ordinary little railway station because it was a little small town, Auschwitz. And we knew this was really the worst of the death camps, because there were labor camps, concentration camps, and death camps. But Auschwitz was definitely a death camp. We really knew deep down that that's it, we are going to be killed. But this is human nature, I suppose. As long as there is life, there is hope, and you don't want to believe bad things, you really see somewhere, perhaps an opening, you see light. And so deep down we knew this will be our last day on earth. My mother, the next command was men and women to separate sides. So the men marched to a different path. And this was really, I did actually see my father several times afterward, but I never ever saw my brother again. And my mother and me, of course, we stayed behind. And the SS was standing there shouting rows of 5. Everything was always done in rows of 5, because that was the easiest way for them to keep an eye on things. And so we stood in rows of 5, and we had to march forward to where the SS was standing, and they looked us over, and they decided this side and that side. At that time, we didn't know what those different sides was. And at that point, my mother gave me her hat and coat, and she said, put it on. Perhaps you can keep it. I mean, you know, she says till her dying days, she said, I don't know, I must have heard a voice that I should give you this. And through wearing this hat, because it was a selection, and the selection meant that no young people or old people were going into the camp, and it went by looks, not by age. I've heard a child asking me, I heard that from 15 upwards and from 40 downwards, you were allowed to go in the camp. I said, it didn't go by age. You didn't tell them how old you were. It went by looks. But through wearing this hat, this Mengele, because he was the one who selected, didn't see how young I was. And so I passed to the right side.
So we heard from Eva Schloss, her experience, which is part of something that we now know was called the final solution. The final solution was the Nazi plan to kill every single Jewish individual in Europe. And so we can see how Nazi persecution, anti-Semitism, and violence escalates to something like the final solution. We see in 1935, the Nuremberg laws. 3 years later, in 1938, something like the Kristallnacht. A year later, the start of World War II. And by 1942, we see high-ranking Nazi party officials meeting and coming up with a plan to kill as many Jewish individuals as quickly as possible in Europe. Now, before the Nazis decided on this plan they called the final solution, they had already started killing Jewish individuals in concentration camps. But it wasn't until 1942 with the final solution that we see the Nazis put in place trying to kill as many Jewish individuals as possible, and that we see them start to build and implement what's known as death camps or killing centers. And so with the final solution in 1942, we see a significant increase in the murder of Jewish individuals. So it's this stage, the final solution, that most people and most students, particularly middle school students, think of when they think about the Holocaust. But it's really important to stress for our students that this step, the final solution, didn't happen until 9 years after Hitler and the Nazi Party gained power in 1933 and the Holocaust officially began. The Holocaust happened gradually over time. It started with anti-Semitic words and propaganda as Hitler and the Nazi Party slowly gained power in Germany. Then we see anti-Jewish laws and segregation with the Nuremberg laws. Then we see gradually more violent events like Kristallnacht in 1938. And then we finally see the final solution in 1942 with the building of killing centers. And so with the final solution, the Nazis and their collaborators began to move Jewish individuals out of ghettos and other concentration camps and sent them to killing centers like the one Eva and her family was sent to, Auschwitz. In Auschwitz alone, over 1 million people were murdered at just this one camp. And what Eva describes is something that was called the selection process. As people arrived at the camp, they were separated into 2 groups, one that would be immediately killed in gas chambers and the other group that would be used for slave labor. And Eva was saved from being sent to the gas chambers to her death by her mom putting a hat on her head to make her look older. And I think here it's really important to stress for students that this is not inevitable. I've worked a lot with 5th grade students and I've worked a lot with middle school students, and it's really easy for them to feel like this was an inevitable tragic event like a hurricane or a tornado. But in actuality, and all of the things that we've talked about today, from the Nuremberg laws to Kristallnacht to the final solution, individuals had choices at each of those events, and those choices mattered and they had consequences. They allowed the Nazis to go further and further, eventually resulting in the final solution. And so by the end of World War II, the Nazis and their supporters had murdered 11 million people. 6 million people in the Holocaust, 6 million Jewish individuals were killed. But beyond the 6 million individuals killed in the Holocaust, there were 5 million other non-Jewish victims as well. Many of these other victims include individuals with physical and mental disabilities, political prisoners, Roma and Sinti, Afro-Germans, LGBTQ individuals, and Jehovah's Witnesses as well. And so this was a mass murder of Jewish individuals, but others during this time period as well. And so this is where Kristallnacht eventually led to. And I think when we teach Kristallnacht in our classrooms, we have to remember that it was one stage in a much bigger event, and that at each stage, individuals had choices to make, just like those bystanders we saw in the image I showed you from the US HMM. And so with that, we are going to move on to some museum resources. World War II, the Holocaust, Kristallnacht, those are all really, really difficult topics to teach in your classroom. I know because I've been there. And so the World War II Museum and the Institute for Curriculum Services, we both have resources to help you teach this really difficult topic in history. And so for the World War II Museum, we offer a series of curriculum kits that cover 4 different topics related to World War II: War in Pacific, War in Europe, Homefront, and Liberation and Legacy. And it's in that last curriculum kit that you'll find a lot of resources related to the Holocaust. Now, these curriculum kits are available in print. If you email me, I can ship you those physical kits. We are out of stock of the first 2 kits, but I can ship you the last 2 kits that are still currently in stock. Or if you're more of a digital person, all of our curriculum is available online at worldwar2classroom.org. This is also where you can find a lot of different oral history clips to incorporate into your classroom to teach these difficult events. Beyond that, we also offer a lot of different education programs ranging from virtual field trips for your students and your classes to online courses for teachers, as well as in-person summer teacher professional development, where we pay for you to come on site to the museum in July, and applications for those summer in-person on-site programs open on December 5th. And so if you want to learn more about some of the resources that the World War II Museum offers, you can scan that QR code. It'll pull up a bunch of different links for you, from everything from our curriculum kit series to virtual field trips to additional webinars as well. And then I do also want to give Dory the floor to follow up with some resources from her institution as well.
Thank you so much, Isabel. That was fascinating information. Really quickly, what you will find on the Institute for Curriculum Services website is what you see there on the screen. You will see a complete lesson plan for this topic of History of European Antisemitism. You'll find a presentation slide deck that you can utilize. In addition to, I want to mention that there are 2 different student activities that you can implement that highly utilize primary sources, and then on the next.
Oh, Dory, you're muted.
Oh my goodness, I am so sorry. So I was thanking you and telling you that that was absolutely fascinating, and to let you know that on our website for the topic of History of European Antisemitism, you will find the things that you see there on the screen. Like it says, an incomplete lesson plan, a presentation slide deck, a variety of student engagement activities that are all rooted in primary sources, and they're all different types of sources. There's images, there are maps, there are political cartoons, there are documents, a variety of different types of primary sources for your students to analyze. And then just really quickly in the chat box, I added the link to the sessions resources. So you could do one of 2 things. You could grab that link that's in the chat box, or a similar idea is grab the QR code like Isabel had shared with you for their resources, but I have also put the link to that in the chat box as well. That is one link that houses all of the resources for the topic that I shared in the session. And then I think, oh, yeah, there we go. And then this is very important to us. First of all, again, I want to thank Isabel and the World War II Museum for inviting me to be a part of, or me and the Institute for Curriculum Services to be a part of this webinar. I learned a tremendous amount from you, Isabel, and it was wonderful learning alongside of all of you educators. I want to thank you so much for joining us and for participating in the History of European Antisemitism session that I led. And I do want to ask if you could please take a moment to complete the session's evaluation. Your feedback is how we continue to create curriculum that will support you and what you do. That is our main goal. And lastly, I just want to say, please stay connected with us. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Instagram. You can join our emailing list, but please stay connected to us. And I hope this isn't the first time or the last time that we will be learning together. So again, thank you so much. And Isabel, thank you to you as well.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. It was wonderful having Dory here to help lead the seminar, or to lead most of the seminar. I learned a lot, as always, from you, Dory. And thank you for everyone who has participated. Dory and I will both be following up in the next couple of days to share session resources, the survey again, as well as the slides and the session, the webinar recording. So keep an eye out in your inbox for that email. And I hope that you guys all have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you guys so much for joining us.